Come to order. I want to first thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to write your testimony. Those of you appearing in person, traveling here to D.C. to give it orally and also answer our questions. The title of this hearing now is, I guess, examining the U.S. approach to early COVID-19 treatments. I thought it was. I originally set out a title of Early Treatments for COVID, an Essential Component of a COVID Solution. It was inevitable that the coronavirus pandemic would be politicized, and it's a tragedy that it was. From the start, I knew it was impossible to have a perfect response. We were facing a new virus that caused an entirely new disease. No one wanted to underreact, and as a result, I feared the tendency would be to overreact and create unrealistic expectations regarding our ability to stop a highly contagious pathogen. The challenges facing us were daunting. Our national strategic stockpile had been reduced during the H1N1 pandemic and had not been replenished. It took time to develop a reliable test and even more time to scale up production to meet the demand. The fact that a large percentage of people that become infected exhibit no symptoms made the coronavirus even more difficult to detect and contain. I have tried not to criticize elected officials that have had the responsibility to make very tough decisions with limited and highly imperfect information. Others have not been so reluctant. Perhaps my background in manufacturing taught me to be more understanding of those forced to face and deal with very difficult situations. The members of this committee have had a front row seat to government's response at both the federal and state level. We have participated in dozens of conference calls and multiple hearings with agency officials who have worked 24/7 to respond to an unprecedented event. It is always easy to criticize, but I, for one, have been sympathetic with the challenges they faced and highly appreciative of their efforts. As we are all aware, the coronavirus is not going away. Even though it appears an effective vaccine may have been developed and might be available in record time, people will continue to become infected and sick for months to come. We still need to develop effective therapies, particularly in the very early stages of the disease. It is on this point that I have been and will continue to be highly critical of our collective dereliction in not robustly exploring therapies designed to stop viral replication and halt the progression of the disease. We are all aware that Tamiflu is only effective when prescribed early enough to stop the flu virus from replicating and before the patient becomes too sick. Why haven't federal agencies and the medical community applied the same logic and approach to the coronavirus? This question has baffled me since March, and there probably is not a single explanation. We do know the coronavirus was politicized and used as an effective weapon in the presidential election. We also know some of the suggested therapies included off-the-shelf supplements and off-label uses of widely prescribed drugs. The cost of these therapies is well under $50 versus a brand new drug, remdesivir, that costs over $3,000 and can only be used in hospital and therefore does not prevent hospitalization in the first place. Could Big Pharma have played a role in discouraging less costly alternatives? I think the answer seems pretty obvious, even though their methods will no doubt remain obscure. This hearing is not about promoting any one particular therapy over others. Although, as a quick aside, by reading the testimony and watching the tweets, it may be unavoidable. But I have to say the absence of any serious NIH study or consideration of hydroxychloroquine, either by itself or in combination with other drugs and supplements, is worth discussing. This is a drug that has been safely and effectively used to prevent malaria and treat lupus and rheumatoid arthritis for decades. Yet doctors who have had the courage to follow the Hippocratic Oath and use their off-label prescription rights to treat patients using hydroxychloroquine have been scorned, and state medical boards have threatened to withdraw their licenses. The same has happened to pharmacists filling prescriptions for the drug in some states. Will those using ivermectin or other off-the-shelf drugs being used off-label to treat COVID patients suffer the same fate? Since the onset of this pandemic, I have publicly advocated for allowing doctors to be doctors, to practice medicine, explore different therapies, and share their knowledge within the medical community and with the public. I believe international, federal, and state medical agencies and institutions have let us down. I fear too many have been closed-minded bureaucrats, potentially driven by conflicting interests and agendas. Tragically, media and the social media have failed to ask the right questions and censored what they do not understand. My public advocacy has connected me to doctors who care and who are trying to compassionately help their patients in spite of the bureaucratic roadblocks that they have encountered. Over the last month, I've been included in an email group comprising over 250 practicing physicians from all over the world, sharing their knowledge and experience. 3 members of that group are here today. To me, it is obvious that we should robustly explore every possible treatment to combat this pandemic at every stage of the disease. Why has there been such resistance to low-cost, off-the-shelf therapies that might stop the progression of COVID-19 and help keep people out of hospitals and the intensive care units? I hope today's hearing can answer that question and provide direction on how to correct this glaring blunder that has cost far too many lives. I just want to make a couple other points. A personal story to make a point. My first child, my daughter Carrie, was born with a very serious congenital heart defect called transposition of the great arteries. Her aorta and pulmonary artery were reversed. The first day of life, a wonderful man, Dr. John Thomas, came in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, and performed a balloon septostomy. They catheterized her heart, shoved an uninflated balloon through a hole in the chamber of her heart, blew the balloon open, pulled it back, and ripped a larger hole so that her blood could oxygenate until she was old enough to have a surgery which occurred 8 months later with another incredibly skilled surgeon, Dr. John Foker, rebaffled the upper chamber of her heart. Now, at the time, some people were using Dacron to do that baffle. This surgeon had developed a technique of using pericardial tissue so it would grow with the heart. Now, my daughter is 37 years old today, a mother of 2 children, and a nurse practitioner in a NICU previously. We had a wonderful result because I had access to doctors and to treatments produced by previous doctors that practice medicine. I don't think there's a random controlled trial on the balloon septostomy or that Schumacher rebaffling technique. These were skilled physicians practicing medicine. What I have found over the last 8 or 9 months in dealing with this issue is we have fewer practicing doctors and more doctors that follow protocols, which is entirely appropriate. I completely agree with practicing protocols, using random controlled trials. But there are moments in medicine, moments in our history where you have to allow doctors to practice medicine, to develop these therapies, and that's been the history, quite honestly, of the development of medicine. My final point is to talk about the bill I championed through Congress, Right to Try. Now, the current situation, for example, with hydroxychloroquine is not a prime example of right to try because hydroxychloroquine is a fully approved drug. What Right to Try says is if a drug has gone through the first 2 stages of FDA approval, so it's been proven safe, but it hasn't gone through the final efficacy approval. A patient and a doctor still have the right to try that if there are no other available treatments. Isn't that the position we're in early treatment of COVID? There's no other treatments. And yet doctors who've had the courage to practice medicine and try things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine have been scorned and worse. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I'm glad there's a vaccine, but that vaccine will not be widely available for months. More people will get sick. More people will die. I, for one, am for allowing doctors to practice medicine to treat patients compassionately as early as possible so they don't progress into the hospital and the intensive care unit. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. We now have lost more than 250,000 Americans to coronavirus. The United States is now the first country in the world to reach more than 170,000 confirmed COVID cases in a single day. Those numbers, unfortunately, are continuing to rise. In my home state of Michigan, positivity rates rose to almost 12%, and we have lost 439 Michiganders to this pandemic in just the last week. In order to successfully tackle this pandemic, our response must be driven by recommendations from public health officials that are rooted in science and transparency. It will take an all-hands-on-deck approach to ensure that Americans receive the most accurate information on how to protect themselves. Unfortunately, misinformation and disinformation continue to run rampant. That's why I introduced legislation to create a COVID-19 disinformation and misinformation task force that would work to slow the spread of unfounded information and in the process save American lives. As members of Congress, we also have a responsibility to ensure the information we present to the public is accurate and rooted in science. Americans must be able to rely on and trust the independent Food and Drug Administration and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Political interference and misinformation undermines the hard work that dedicated scientists and experts are carrying out at these critical agencies. We must also be careful of giving Americans a false sense of security by promoting untested and unproven outpatient remedies. We all want answers that will keep our families healthy and safe, but I'm concerned many of the treatments that will be discussed today have been presented as panaceas for the coronavirus. It would be irresponsible to give Americans false hopes that these types of treatments will be enough to keep them safe in lieu of other measures that are scientifically shown to slow the spread of coronavirus. Our nation's top scientists must be able to do their work without meddling to ensure that both treatments and vaccines for COVID are safe and are effective and are trusted by the American people. Unfortunately, this administration has continued to exert pressure on our government's top public health agencies to water down health guidance and even promote unproven treatments, further putting Americans at risk. These actions have also diminished the public's confidence in eventual coronavirus vaccine and treatments. From the very start of the pandemic, the President and others in the administration have consistently undermined and questioned public health experts at the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They have pushed unproven treatments instead of leading by example and practicing simple measures that we know prevent the spread of virus, like wearing a mask and social distancing. We have made significant progress in the development of COVID-19 treatments, but those developments must be free from politics and must be driven by solid data. Recent promising news from both Pfizer and Moderna indicate that their vaccines could be highly effective. However, we're still waiting for further review of this data, and even an authorized or approved vaccine will not likely be widely available for many more months. We must continue to use masks, social distancing, contact tracing, and other measures for the foreseeable future to protect our friends and our neighbors, to stop the spread, and ultimately to save lives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is the current Vice Chair of Internal Medicine at Baylor University Medical Center and a Professor of Medicine at Texas A&M College of Medicine. Dr. McCullough received his M.D. from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School and his M.P.H. from the University of Michigan. Dr. McCullough is board certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine in the areas of internal medicine and cardiovascular disease. He specializes in the treatment of patients with complicated internal medical problems and have major affected major organs, including the heart and kidneys. Dr. McCullough.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peter, and members of the committee for allowing me to talk to you today about the critical need for early ambulatory treatment for COVID-19 as an emergency measure in the middle of this national crisis. As we sit here today, we have the greatest mass of infected Americans that we've ever had since the start of the pandemic, and Americans are pouring into hospitals untreated. The hospital census is already at capacity. A national calamity of unimaginable mortality is right around the corner. In a matter of weeks to months, Americans are going to be horrified with what they see on the news with respect to a hospital overrun, mortality skyrocketing for both COVID and non-COVID complications and conditions, and patients further infecting other Americans as this pandemic spirals out of control. My viewpoint and my views expressed here are those of my own and not necessarily my institutions. My viewpoint is this pandemic should have always been viewed as having 4 pillars. If we can bring up the figure. The first pillar is contagion control. We have had probably the vast majority of government efforts solely focused on contagion control. The entire media representation of what the government has been doing has been on contagion control. Well, as we sit here today, it's obvious contagion control has not solved the problem. The second pillar is early ambulatory treatment. This virus infects individuals, and they sit at home for 2 weeks. We have a 2-week opportunity to treat this problem, and we hear nothing about it. We hear nothing about early ambulatory treatment. There's no updates. There's no viewpoint to Americans of what's going on outside of the United States, where early ambulatory treatment is a standard of care in countries that are doing much better than the United States. It's grossly overlooked. The third pillar is the hospitals, and I've already told you they're overrun. We're doing all the best technologies we possibly can in the hospital, but the hospital's an inadequate safety net. The current hospital mortality rate's about 5 to 7%. When patients get in the ICU, it's 25%. And virtually all the COVID deaths that occur in the hospital. It's obviously not an adequate safety net for Americans. The fourth pillar is vaccination. Vaccination should bring out the close to the pandemic. But this hearing is about early ambulatory treatment. If we can bring up the next figure. We've learned a lot about the virus. There have been over 75,000 peer-reviewed publications in PubMed since the onset of the pandemic. Information is flowing in at about 500 papers a day. So any expert who claims that a review of data and studies is contemporary, they're quickly out of date. And I can tell you with this pandemic and this virus, what we've learned is that there's an early viral replication phase followed by a destructive immune activation called cytokine storm, and then blood clotting thrombosis. And what doctors have done is they've innovated and they've identified, both in the hospital and outside of the hospital, aided by clinical trials and observational studies, an approach that involves combination antivirals followed by corticosteroids and antithrombotic agents. Doctors in the outpatient communities faced with thousands of patients calling and begging for help have innovated. Dr. Zelenko is one in New York in the middle of the calamity in New York who was a early innovator. I summarized these and published them in the American Journal of Medicine, the synthesis of the principles of randomized trials and observational studies. And this algorithm has been updated multiple times and it provides a framework for new drugs and agents to be incorporated in an early ambulatory treatment approach. I've reviewed every report from real-world data from American doctors who have innovated and faced this problem. And I can tell you that they are achieving rates of hospitalization and death less than 3% for high-risk Americans over 50 with multiple conditions. Most doctors can achieve less than 1%. With no treatment in the United States right now, an individual over 50 with medical problems faces a 7% rate of hospitalization and death. Someone in their 80s, that skyrockets to 40%. I can tell you as a doctor, I have always treated high-risk patients with the best tools available. And I looked at all the evidence. When it was obvious that AIDS drugs didn't work, I didn't use them. But hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, if I had favipiravir, I'd combine it with other drugs. And then steroids. That should be non-controversial. Doctors should be using corticosteroids in patients and outpatients. They're supported by both inpatient and outpatient studies, as well as blood thinners. What doctor would not help a patient who's at risk for a catastrophic stroke that occurs as a complication of this condition? So I can tell you right now, I'm not asking for permission to do this, but I'm asking for your help. I'm asking for the government to organize all government agencies that are related to this to assist doctors rapidly with their innovation and their compassionate care of patients with COVID-19 at home, because we can prevent hospitalization and death. And right now, it's the only option on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. Our next witness is Dr. Harvey Risch. Dr. Risch is a professor of epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology at the Public Health at the Yale School of Public Health and the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Risch received his M.D. from the University of California, San Diego, and his Ph.D. in biomathematics from the University of Chicago. He's the author of more than 325 original research publications and is a member of the Connecticut Academy of Sciences and Engineering. This year, Dr. Risch researched the efficacy of 7 outpatient medications for the treatment of high-risk COVID-19 patients in 42 hospitals across Brazil. Dr. Risch.
Senators and colleagues, thank you very much for convening this hearing. We all understand the endemic disease that we are facing and that we have to face head-on and not hide from it, hoping that it will go away. And so I'm going to give you my perspective on this. In May of this year, I observed that results of studies of a drug suggested to treat COVID, hydroxychloroquine, were being misrepresented, but what I thought at the time was sloppy reporting. We've heard from Dr. McCullough how COVID disease progresses in phases, from viral replication to florid pneumonia to multi-organ attack. Viral replication is an outpatient condition, but the pneumonia that fills the lungs with immune system debris and is life-threatening is hospitalizable. We've also heard how each phase, each pathologic aspect of the disease has to have its own specific treatment, how those treatments are derived from the biologic mechanisms of the disease. Thus, I was frankly astounded that the studies of hospital treatments were being represented as applying to outpatients, in violation of what I had learned in how to treat patients in medical school. We're now finally coming to address why over the last 6 months, our government research institutions have invested billions of dollars in expensive patent medications and vaccine development, but almost nothing in early outpatient treatments, the first line of response to this pandemic. And it's not that we've lacked candidate medications to study, we've had a number of promising agents. But I think that the early on conflation of hospital with outpatient disease served to imply that treatment of outpatient disease had been studied and found ineffective. This illogical premise motivated me to look at what actually the evidence for outpatient disease and its treatment were. So I want to reiterate that we are considering the evidence for early treatment of high-risk outpatients to prevent hospitalization and mortality. And that's it. I'm not talking about inpatient disease. That's a totally different consideration. I'm talking only about outpatient disease. So this is treatment starting in the first 5 days or so after the onset of symptoms. Treatment of older patients or patients with chronic conditions like diabetes or obesity, heart diseases, lung diseases, kidney diseases, immune system diseases, survivors from cancer, and so on. These are the people who are most likely to die from COVID, and they are the people most in need of protection. So in doing my research, I sought to obtain reports of every study of every medication pertaining to early treatment of high-risk outpatients. I monitor the literature daily, which is a task. And what I have found is actually remarkable. What I've observed is that while there have been positive reports of a number of drugs, every study of the outpatient use of one particular drug, hydroxychloroquine, with or without accompanying agents, has shown substantial benefit in reducing risks of hospitalization and mortality. Now, these studies break down into 2 major types. The first is the double-blinded, randomized controlled trials that various government and scientific personalities say provide the strongest, supposedly the only trustworthy form of evidence. The second is non-randomized but still controlled trials. There's some truth in that assertion about the nature of the quality of the evidence, but there's also much falsehood. We know, for example, that the great majority of drugs used to treat heart diseases were established before randomized controlled trials, with non-randomized trials. cholesterol-lowering drugs were in widespread use before randomized trials were ever done. Azithromycin, which is the most common antibiotic used in children, was not established by randomized controlled trials. The great majority of drugs that are in use today were not established when they went into widespread use with randomized trials. Many of them had randomized trials later, but the establishment and use of drugs is not always done on the basis of randomized trials, but on the study with other kinds of studies. And thus, the idea that only randomized trials provide trustworthy evidence is a simplistic notion that sounds good in theory, and perhaps Dr. Zhao later may tell you that it's what many doctors believe, but this idea does not stand up to the body of medical studies and data that addresses it. And in fact, we have large amounts of empirical data looking at the difference between non-randomized and randomized trials. Dr. Tom Frieden, who was previously the director of the Centers for Disease Control, in 2017 wrote an extensive essay in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that non-randomized trials and randomized trials provide equivalent compelling evidence, equivalent evidence for the efficacy of treatments. So could you please enter the Frieden article into the record? Underlying this was a gigantic meta-analysis of meta-analyses, what I call a mega-analysis, done by the Cochrane Library Consortium, which is a British organization formed to organize evidence-based medical research. The Cochrane investigators examined what involved tens of thousands of study comparisons. This is a gigantic amount of data between randomized trials and their corresponding non-randomized counterparts. And when they compared these two kinds of studies, they found that they arrived at virtually identical conclusions. And please enter the Engelmeyer study also into the record. This evidence is why well-performed non-randomized trials are every bit as much of a gold standard today as the randomized trials you've heard of. This is empirical data, not opinions. This is empirical data. So what did I find when I investigated hydroxychloroquine in early use among outpatients? Right. The first thing is that this drug is extremely safe, exceedingly safe. We know this from common sense. This is a medication that's been used for 65 years by hundreds of millions of people in tens of billions of doses worldwide, prescribed without routine electrocardiogram screening. It's given to adults, to children, pregnant women, nursing mothers. Such a drug must be safe, and it must be safe when used in the initial viral replication phase of this illness, which is in fact, in outpatients, initially similar to a cold or flu. And so could you please put the Lane paper and its supplement into the evidence, into the record? This is a paper showing of more than 900,000 hydroxychloroquine users that showed no excess mortality and no increased cardiac arrhythmias. And also, please put into the record my article from the American Journal of Epidemiology where I discuss the Lane paper. So in spite of the safety, surprisingly, in July, the FDA posted a warning against outpatient hydroxychloroquine use on its website. And they did this while at the same time, the FDA actually had no systematic evidence of adverse events in outpatients. And the website itself says that it justifies the warning based on evidence that it had in hospital patients. It justified it for use in outpatients, which is what I said before was invalid. There are now 7 studies of early use of hydroxychloroquine in high-risk outpatients, and every one of these studies has shown significant benefit. This includes 636 outpatients in Sao Paulo, Brazil, 199 clinic patients in Marseille, France, 717 patients in a large HMO network in Brazil, 226 nursing home patients in Marseille, more than 1,200 outpatients in New Jersey, 100 long-term care institution patients in Andorra, and almost 8,000 patients across the entire country of Saudi Arabia. All of these studies showed about a 50% or greater reduction in risk of hospitalization or death. And in fact, the Saudi study was, as I said, a national study, and it demonstrated a 5-fold reduction in mortality for hydroxychloroquine plus zinc, the two of them used together, versus zinc and standard of care alone. And none of these studies have shown a single fatal cardiac arrhythmia among the thousands of patients that were treated in these studies that was attributable to hydroxychloroquine. And in fact, in addition to this, there have been 6 outpatient randomized controlled trials. We've heard a lot about this. These trials individually were small and incomplete and were stopped early, but together, when analyzed together, as we did, they show a statistically significant reduction in risk, and that's what matters. So that's the Ladapo paper, if that could be entered into the record also. So this body of evidence for hydroxychloroquine dramatically outweighs the risk-benefit ratio for remdesivir, for monoclonal antibodies, and for the difficult-to-use bamlanivimab that FDA has approved for emergency use authorizations while denying the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine. This is an egregious double standard that FDA did on hydroxychloroquine that needs to be overturned immediately and its emergency use authorization application approved. I'm restating that every outpatient study of hydroxychloroquine has shown benefit. There are no studies, as far as I know of as of last night, that are of high-risk use in outpatients that do not show benefit at all. So now we spent the last 6 months with formal government policies and warnings against outpatient treatment. The government has invested very large amounts in vaccines and expensive new treatments, which have yet to be proven, while there's been almost no support for evaluating inexpensive but useful medications. 250,000 Americans have died from this mismanaged approach. And even if we find that the vaccines eventually work effectively and safely, as we all hope, myself included, people will still get sick and die, and early outpatient treatment is still and will be continuing an essential part of ending this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Risch. Our next witness is Dr. George Fareed. Dr. Fareed is a family medicine specialist in Brawley, California, with over 50 years of experience in the medical field. He graduated with honors from Harvard Medical School in 1970. After 2 decades of teaching and researching in academia, he returned to clinical medicine and established a general practice. Dr. Fareed is currently the medical director and family medicine specialist at Pioneers Medical Center in the Imperial Valley. In the past few months, Dr. Fareed has treated countless COVID-19 patients, both outpatient and inpatient. Dr. Fareed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, senators, and colleagues, thank you for...
Is your mic on?
Oh, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, try and bring it a little bit closer.
Okay.
And by the way, all of your, I know you have longer testimony. I know you have different attachments to that. All that will be entered in the record. Mm-hmm. Dr. Fareed.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, senators, and colleagues. Thank you for convening this hearing. I have a background in virology, as you mentioned, academic background, research standpoint from work at the NIAID as a professor performing research at Harvard Medical School. After I graduated from Harvard in 1970, I became a professor there, and later at UCLA School of Medicine. About 31 years ago, I decided to go into clinical medicine, which is my real passion. I chose a rural area, underserved, where I thought I could make a difference. And I've had experience in that 30 years treating HIV, other infectious diseases, and practicing as a primary care medicine provider and being a hospitalist. My experiences during the pandemic, treating COVID patients, both in the COVID flu stage as outpatients and also as hospitalized patients in the ICU, made me determined to prevent the COVID flu from progressing to the horrible, lonely cytokine storm suffering that I saw in the ICU, and I still see it. We accomplished this with what I present here today. Like everything else in medicine, the goal is to treat early. COVID patients are difficult to treat when they get very sick. The Imperial Valley, where I work, or where we work, became the COVID epicenter for California in June and July. Since early March, both in my Brawley Clinic and Dr. Brian Tyson's All Valley Urgent Care Clinic in El Centro, where I also work, over 25,000 fearful people were screened. Over 2,400 were COVID-19 positive, and we treated successfully over 1,000 high-risk and symptomatic ones. The interesting thing to me is that Dr. Tyson and I independently came to the same protocol for that purpose back in March. And we based it upon the great work from Dr. Zelenko and Dr. Raoul. Actually, they're our heroes, actually. It was a triple hydroxychloroquine cocktail, HCQ, 3,200 milligrams over 5 days, azithromycin or doxycycline, and especially zinc, which is often left out in the studies. The cocktail is best given early, as Dr. McCullough has indicated, within the first 5 to 7 days where the patient is in the flu stage. The timing of the drug is when the virus is in a very active maximal replication phase in the upper respiratory tract, and our goal has been and still is to prevent it from entering the lower respiratory tract and to prevent hospitalization. And we achieved this in over 1,000 patients. And that was involved reevaluating them at 2 to 3 day intervals. We blend in corticosteroids and prolong the HCQ treatment for 5 or more days if symptoms warrant, but they generally did not and do not. We use it especially in the high-risk individuals, as Dr. McCullough indicated, those over 50 to 60, those with comorbidities, or actually in anyone with moderate to severe flu symptoms. We want to avoid the long COVID syndrome in all patients that happens after they recover. The healthy do not need the treatment. I used this regimen to treat 31 elderly nursing home residents in an outbreak in June, and 29 recovered fully. The drug works mechanistically through multiple actions. The ionophores HCQ, the gun, and zinc, the bullet. HCQ blocks the sigma-1 receptor and has several other direct antiviral effects. The antibiotic also has an antiviral effect and potentiates the action of HCQ and zinc. As additional anti-COVID agents become available, they can be added to this regimen to enhance its efficacy. And we are routinely now combining ivermectin, which you mentioned, Chairman, in a quadruple HCQ IVM cocktail with excellent results, since ivermectin is safe and has a different anti-COVID action. This becomes analogous to the use of multiple agents for HIV treatment. Monoclonal antibodies from Regeneron and Lilly will be suitable also when readily available. The results are consistently good, often dramatic, with improvement within 48 hours. We wouldn't have stayed with this if it weren't helping people and always reliable. We've seen very few hospitalizations. We've seen not a single negative cardiac event. Our experiences are in line with all the studies that Dr. Risch has mentioned concerning early use of the HCQ cocktail. Let me be clear. This is only about the science of viral replication, the science of the stages of COVID, and the science why early treatment works. And early treatment has led us to actually try to communicate our approach. And we think it should be on a national level. We wrote a letter with my colleagues to the president, a letter to congressmen, a letter to the California Health Department, an open letter to Dr. Fauci, and a national plan for COVID-19. As we describe in the national plan, this approach would be part of the solution to the pandemic. Protect the vulnerable, and if high-risk individuals get sick, there is a solution for them with early treatment with the antiviral cocktail. If early treatment becomes widely available, people will be much more confident going back to work and sending their kids back to school. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fareed. Our final witness is Dr. Ashish Jha. Dr. Jha is the Dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, a practicing physician, and a health policy researcher. Dr. Jha received his MD from Harvard Medical School and his M.P.H. from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. In 2013, he was elected to National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Jha is a globally recognized expert on pandemic preparedness response, has led groundbreaking research regarding the Ebola response, and is now on the front lines of the COVID-19 response effort. His research focuses on improving the quality and cost of healthcare systems with a specialization on the impact of public policy on these systems. He currently practices as a general internist at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Providence, Rhode Island. Dr. Jha.
So good morning, and Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters. I'm sorry I cannot be there with you in person today, but it is my honor to be part of this hearing. As you've heard, we are entering the most difficult days of this pandemic. And so I am so pleased that the committee has met to discuss the value of outpatient therapies, treatments that can be given early in the disease course. By treating people early, we can prevent hospitalizations and save lives. And the good news is that there are outpatient therapies that are being evaluated, and we should be hopeful, I am hopeful, that some of them will work. One area where outpatient therapy has largely not been useful is hydroxychloroquine. Earlier in the year, the FDA issued a surprising emergency use authorization for this medicine. And as subsequent data came in, the EUA was revoked because it became clear that hydroxychloroquine was unlikely to be effective for COVID-19. So was the FDA justified in issuing an EUA in March? I believe it was not. EUAs are contingent on three interrelated questions. First, is there sufficient data to even make a judgment? Do we have enough evidence? Second, do the potential benefits outweigh the risks? And finally, will there be an opportunity to collect more data over time so we can refine any EUA decisions? For hydroxychloroquine, there was not sufficient evidence, and the evidence that was there certainly did not suggest benefits would outweigh the risks. The basis for the hydroxychloroquine EUA was some laboratory studies and really ultimately one small non-randomized, non-blinded study of hospitalized patients in France, findings that were later discredited, and the scientist who led that work is now facing disciplinary actions. Since then, dozens of studies have examined the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. And here is the bottom line. Every single high-quality study has failed to find any benefit of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19. And I have to say I am disappointed. Hydroxychloroquine is a cheap and widely available medicine. Had it been effective, it would have made an enormous difference in this pandemic. Unfortunately, it isn't effective, and it has not made a difference. And there is now clear consensus in the medical and scientific community based on overwhelming evidence that hydroxychloroquine provides no benefit in treating COVID-19, including in the outpatient setting. So let's talk evidence. A large randomized controlled trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine found no benefit of hydroxychloroquine given to outpatients who had been exposed to SARS-CoV-2. The recovery trial found higher rates of death among hospitalized patients on hydroxychloroquine. But this included people whose symptoms had begun within the past 7 days, that early phase of the disease that Dr. Risch talked about. Other inpatient trials have found similar results. There are outpatient high-quality randomized double-blind controlled trials, and they have also failed to find a benefit. Now, Dr. Risch talked about observational studies, and we should talk about observational studies. Can they be helpful? The answer is they can. Now, we don't generally use them for treatments because we want high-quality data, but it is possible to use high-quality observational studies. High-quality observational studies require control groups that are comparable and use sophisticated statistical techniques and look for things like natural experiments to help us understand whether something is likely to be useful. I am not aware of any observational study of hydroxychloroquine that is of particularly high quality. And for every poorly done observational study that shows benefits, we can find poorly done observational studies that show harm. The way out of the low quality evidence quagmire is to generate higher quality data. It turns out that history of medicine is replete with treatments that we all thought worked, but turned out not to. Anecdotal evidence, it turns out, is not actually evidence. The miracles of American medicine have come from applying rigorous scientific standards to our ideas. And each time hydroxychloroquine has been subjected to such a test, it has failed. Let me make 2 more points as I finish up. One is that I'm often asked by people, well, in the middle of a crisis, how can it hurt? The FDA issued its EUA for hydroxychloroquine in March of this year. In April, there was a 93% increase in related calls to the US poison control centers. These things can hurt. And finally, a word about the EUA process. When the FDA scientists are left alone to examine the science and data, the process largely works. They understand the urgency of the moment and the need for faster approvals. But authorizing therapies due to political pressure or with little to no data does far more harm than good. As a physician, I've been troubled by the politicization of hydroxychloroquine. It's a potential therapy. We should study it. And if it works, we should use it. And if it doesn't, we shouldn't. But I have to be honest, given the dismal failure of hydroxychloroquine to date, there is little scientific basis to think it will be effective for anybody. And at this point in the pandemic, with so much suffering and death, we should focus our efforts on promising approaches to help Americans get through this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zaha. As I said in my opening statement, I kind of figured this was going to not necessarily be as broad a discussion based on other early treatments, and we're going to get into dispute on hydroxychloroquine, so I guess so be it. Obviously, we have a huge disconnect between testimony here, between experts. You know, Harvard and Yale educated doctors and PhDs. Dr. McCullough, I know the 93% increase in poison reportings sounds pretty scary. You'd mentioned before the hearing a little bit about what that's based on. Can you talk about that? And also, I guess you've had COVID. You've recovered from it. Not totally. You tested negative, so you don't represent a danger. But can you, first of all, talk about that 93% increase in safety or in poison reportings, and then also just talk about your own personal experience with your own treatment?
Senator, I want my testimony to clearly be on the record that I think Dr. G's testimony is reckless and dangerous for the nation. And his comment regarding the poison control reporting is exactly what Dr. Peters is interested in. You're interested in misinformation regarding COVID. That report in the middle of the pandemic, when hydroxychloroquine early on was appropriately used, that first wave of the pandemic, that's what kept it from skyrocketing. Hydroxychloroquine was widely used early on. That's what kept the March, April, May curve down, okay? When it was used, and we had 500,000 dose administrations of hydroxychloroquine, the Poison Control Center received, I think the number was 77 additional calls. And when the reviewer looked at it, 2/3 of them, somebody took an extra dose and they were concerned. So it boiled down to 17 cases out of over 500,000 administrations. And yet Dr. G holds that up to the American public as a scare point to scare the public away from a safe and effective therapy for COVID-19. And as you mentioned, I had it myself. I'm 57. I've got asthma. I've got atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. I can tell you, Senator Peters, I was not falsely reassured sitting at home. Believe me, when I got that test result, I was terrified. And every American is terrified. Every older patient with heart and lung disease, when they get the report, they're not falsely reassured and sit at home, think this is going to be a picnic. They are scared to death. And by the time they come to the hospital, it is frank terror because they know they're going to be isolated. They'll never see their family members again. What did I do? I did the right thing. I got myself rapidly into a FDA approved treatment protocol through a study. Hard to do, by the way, because the government offers no resources to the public to quickly get into clinical trials. I got into a clinical trial. I took hydroxychloroquine as part of a multi-drug sequenced program, which is exactly what's in the peer-reviewed literature, which is the framework of how Americans should be treated. Well, I was a few days behind in recognizing what was going on. The virus got into my lungs. I had pulmonary involvement, and I got anxious. I got to the point where I thought maybe I could be hospitalized. And I can tell you firsthand, this cocktail of drugs works for sure, but hydroxychloroquine, dose by dose, settles down that fever, settles down, reduces the amount of the severity, intensity of symptoms. And by that mechanism, that's the reason why hydroxychloroquine reduces hospitalizations and death. When patients get anxious and they can't breathe anymore, they go to the hospital. So this isn't complicated. There's over 100 studies. They are all supportive. The EUA says when the preponderance of evidence shows the drug works and has acceptable safety, we ought to go. My view is we need to go with this on everybody high risk in America.
Dr. Risch, when you listen to Dr. Jahai, sounds very authoritative. Do you have a response?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think that what I said early on about the conflation of hospital with outpatient studies is apparent, that there's been lots of studies, and there's no doubt that there are plenty of hospital studies, and some of those hospital studies indeed show no benefit, if not harm. And there are reasons for that, and I don't want to get into the technical issues of these studies, but just to say it's irrelevant. Studies of hospital patients are irrelevant. We are considering outpatient disease and outpatient treatment that starts in the first 5 days. There are only 7 studies. Now, Dr. Jha says, oh, well, these are not high-quality studies. But in fact, they are high-quality studies. These are controlled studies They're tantamount to randomized, except that the patients chose whether to take the medications or not, with consulting with their doctors. Now you may say, well, couldn't that lead to biases? And the answer to that is yes, but the bias is that when patients are sick, they're more likely to take the medication they're offered, and when not quite as sick, but they know they've got the virus, they'll say, oh, maybe I'll just see how it goes, and maybe I won't have to take the medications. And so what you have is a built-in bias to doing worse for the people who do take the medications. And in spite of that built-in bias, the patients do better. The studies in Brazil and the various other studies all show that the bias there is against finding a benefit of the drugs, and in spite of that bias, the studies show benefit of the drugs. Furthermore, these studies all measure all of the different variables about the state of the patients, both on the conditions, the chronic conditions that they have, about the progression of their illness, and so on, that reflects how likely they are to be hospitalized or not, independent of the drug. And the studies address that by what we call statistical adjustment. So these studies, we're not back in 1950 doing epidemiology. We're back in 2020 doing epidemiology, where we know all of the advanced statistics and all the methods for removing potential biases in these kinds of studies. These are the studies that were done and how they were analyzed. And these are what studies show the benefit. And these are the studies, the kinds of studies that the Cochrane organization, the Cochrane Library Consortium, compared in tens of thousands of studies of modern epidemiologic studies, compared those kinds of studies to their corresponding randomized trials and showed no difference. So you can't label these studies as poor quality studies and give a blanket on that. If you want to say a study in particular is poor, as the original study of 40 patients in Marseille was, that no one is now including, that was a motivating study, but not an evidential study, that no one is claiming these are poor studies. These are good modern studies. And the only difference is the randomization, which instead we adjust for and have shown by the Cochrane analysis that they are equivalent to randomized trials.
We do need to stay on time, so my 7 minutes up, but I do want to just quickly go to Dr. Farid. And I would ask the witnesses to kind of watch the clock as you're answering questions as well to stay in time. But just very quickly, Dr. Farid, do you believe you put any of your patients at risk by treating them the way you have? I mean, as a doctor who looks at patients with compassion, do you believe it would have been better for you to do nothing and just send your patients home with no treatment whatsoever, hopefully to survive this without having to go in the hospital? Can you just kind of comment on that?
Yeah, I am concerned for safety of my patients, and I've not ever wanted to put any patient at risk, and I've was concerned early, slightly, but not very much, because of the results I had researched, and my colleague also, Dr. Tyson, had taken the same approach. So the answer to your question is that I have no qualms, no concern whatsoever. I'm very pleased to put the patient on the protocol and to enhance it with the other agents that we can blend in, because I know they'll get better, and they are so appreciative. It's very gratifying, quite frankly. It's almost like I treat HIV patients, and it's been very gratifying to treat HIV patients because they can go into complete remission. It wasn't, when I started, it was a full-blown epidemic and people were dying right and left. But now, for COVID-19, I'm happy to get a call from Kansas or somewhere else where their doctors are not providing them with treatment, and to immediately call it in, because I know it's safe and it's only going to help.
Okay, thank you. And again, I believe patients, Americans, have the right to try these things that have already been FDA approved. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions for Dr. Jha. Dr. Jha, since the start of this pandemic, there have been reports of pressure by this White House on both the CDC and the FDA to influence what should be independent, evidence-based public health decisions. So, Dr. Jha, my first question is, what impact does political interference have on our nation's ability to effectively respond to a health emergency?
Yeah, Senator Peters, thank you for that question. Science has always been bipartisan, and we've seen the scientific agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, be safeguarded from politicization under President Bush, under President Obama. These agencies have largely been left to do their job because we believe and we know that the American people benefit when the best scientific minds apply their expertise to the problems at hand. And I believe that in each of those administrations, you could disagree with policy ideas, but the fundamental underlying scientific work of those agencies was always left intact. That has been different in this administration. We have seen the CDC pressured not to speak out about things where the evidence is very clear on certain issues. We've seen the FDA be pressured around emergency use authorizations, for instance. What happened with convalescent plasma with Dr. Stephen Hahn going to the White House and saying things that were clearly not accurate, and everybody in the medical community knew they were not accurate, was baffling. I think it was upsetting because throughout my medical career, saying something like this is FDA approved was a gold standard. It meant that it had gone through a vigorous scientific review and had passed that review. Those words have become less powerful now. So I believe that politicization of our scientific agencies has hampered our response. It has made it far less effective, and it's one of the reasons why America continues to have one of the worst responses in the world, with 250,000 Americans dead and more than 11 million Americans infected with this virus.
Dr. Jha, last month I released a report on the development and the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, which found that the administration's politicization of the COVID-19 response that you've just referred to has actually contributed to a sharp decline in Americans' receptiveness to an eventual vaccine. My question to you, Dr. Jha, would you agree with that conclusion? And what can the federal government do to rebuild trust and ensure Americans can feel confident that any vaccine authorized or approved by the FDA is one that they should feel comfortable taking?
Yeah, Senator Peters, I would first begin by talking about the whole vaccine development process, which I think has been done with incredible scientific integrity. It's been done extremely well, overseen by this White House. And I think the science behind what has happened, the partnership between the federal government and academia and industry has been a model for how we should behave. So on one hand, I think that has been terrific. I think what has gotten us into a bit of trouble in the last couple of months is as election time was nearing, you started hearing political leaders talk about having a vaccine before the election or pressures to get the vaccine out before the election. I think that created a real concern among the American people that we were not going to use a scientific timeline, but a political timeline to make a decision. I think the FDA, again, has done a very good job. They laid out criteria for what they would need to see before they would authorize a vaccine. And when those criteria are met, I expect that the FDA will authorize vaccines. Ultimately, if we want to build confidence with the American people, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, what you want to know is, are scientists getting to evaluate the data and make scientific recommendations free of political pressure from any side of the political aisle? And if we can let the FDA do that, I think it will go a long way towards building confidence in this vaccine.
Dr. Jha, misinformation and disinformation surrounding COVID-19 treatments and vaccine runs rampant across the internet. Americans clearly need to have clear information about treatments that have been scientifically shown, and put the emphasis on scientifically shown to benefit patients, and certainly not unproven remedies that you can find on the internet. That's why I introduced the COVID-19 Misinformation and Disinformation Task Force. And my question to you, Dr. Jha, is what impact does false and misleading information about COVID-19 treatments have on the American public?
Yeah, so Senator Peters, this has been a huge challenge. We are facing the biggest global public health crisis of a century, and it has been compounded substantially by the sheer amount of misinformation and disinformation that is out there. In order for us to have gotten through this pandemic without suffering the staggering losses we have suffered, What we needed was collective action. What we needed was people pulling in the same direction, guided by science and evidence. But when we have had things like politicization of mask wearing, we know that there is now very compelling evidence that if people wear masks in the right setting, it can make a very big difference. We know that social distancing can make a big difference in reducing infections. We know that testing and tracing can work. We've seen it in parts of the US, we've seen it in other countries, but the misinformation makes it harder for people to know what is right and what is wrong. It makes it harder for people to know what the right thing to do is. And that has really created a problem for us as an American people to do the things that will keep our population safe. And the impact is obvious. The impact is, 11 million Americans infected, 250,000 Americans dead. And right now we are in the worst phase of the pandemic. We can get out of this. We have more than enough capability and capacity as an American people, but the misinformation is really what's killing us at this point.
Dr. Jha, while the FDA has issued 4 emergency use authorizations for COVID-19, one has since been rescinded and another has been criticized as premature due to weak data. The GAO report issued earlier this week found that FDA's decision-making process for issuing these emergency use authorizations lack transparency. Do you believe the FDA's EUA process is working as intended, and what potential reforms should we consider?
Yeah, so the EUA mechanism is really important, right? Because in an emergency, you don't need, and nor do you want to necessarily wait for full approval that you might under non-emergency circumstances. But whenever you lower the bar of evidence, whenever you use an alternative mechanism in order to build confidence with the American people, because at the end of the day, it's all about confidence, it's all about trust. What you need is a process that is transparent. What I believe we need to hear is less from the political appointees and more from career scientists. And what we need is very clear criteria. And I think if those are things, those are guiding principles that we use, I have no doubt we can build back all of the confidence that has been lost in the FDA, in the CDC, in other agencies. But we've got to go back to that. It's worked for us for a very long time. And we have to go back to first principles of transparency, openness, and letting the scientists do the talking and letting the scientists do the decision making.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Romney. Is Senator Romney no longer on? Senator Carper. I'll just go down the list. Senator Hassan.
She's on the OWA call.
Okay. Is everybody on that call? I mean, there is a, just to let the witnesses know, there's a, Langford's available? I'll go to Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for all the witnesses. I appreciate very much your engagement and for the work on this. There are obviously lots of questions just on the process. We have every confidence that there's work being done both in the science community, in the federal and private sector, and in the federal side, and quite frankly, quite a few states as well. They're trying to do what they can to be able to help in the process. The challenge that we have right now is trying to be able to get all these things happening at once. It's been a remarkable year for these things to be able to move. Much of what we've talked about today is an area that has not been discussed much, and that is what can be done in the earliest phases of a virus, any virus at this point, COVID-19, SARS-2, to be able to help diminish its effects or its replication. We've talked a lot about how to protect each other by wearing a mask, which is a good idea, washing hands, all of those things. There's a lot of research going on the mortality side, what can be done in the hospital once we've got blood thickening and inflammation in organs, all those things, but it's the in-between, and I appreciate the dialogue about the in-between at this point. What I'd like to be able to talk about with the physicians that are here is just take a normal virus. What would you recommend for cold and flu season, whatever it may be, that individuals should take to be able to help their bodies fight off a normal virus, and then add to that what would be in addition to, in particular, what we've gained from this virus as well? as we go through this. That's something that I just don't think there's been enough research and conversation about those two aspects. So I'd be interested in hear all of our physicians just answering those questions, because I think that's the key issue. What is typical for a normal virus, and what's helpful to help the body fight off a virus and its own your own system to fight it off, and what are we finding helpful, even if it's only a little bit. What are we finding helpful with this particular virus? So I'll let everybody just take it in any order they want to take that in.
We'll start with Dr. McCullough.
Thank you for the question, Senator. Let me say, I think we should probably narrow the question to serious and potential fatal viral infections. So acute HIV, which is an acute serious problem, 3 to 5 drugs. 3 to 5 drugs. Hepatitis C, 3 drugs, 4 drugs. Even shingles, acute shingles, which can be a real painful problem later on, 2 drugs. But the principle is always early. I can't think of a single viral infection where the best advice is to wait 2 weeks before we start treatment in the hospital. That's the current NIH recommendations. Americans are appalled by this. We always treat serious viral infections with multiple drugs up front early. These are principles of treatment.
Dr. Risch, quickly.
I'd like to defer to
Dr. Freed.
I think, on this.
That's a great question. It's, I believe, important for people to be proactive. We've learned a lot of what's good to help protect people from COVID-19. And, excuse me, we've recommended, and what we've recommended to the general population where I practice is applicable to helping protect against other viral infections at this time, like influenza. And that is a good, strong multivitamin, a particularly zinc supplement, 15 to 25 milligrams a day, vitamin D3, 2 to 5,000 units a day, and a antioxidant like quercetin or EGCG, and it's a supplement that helps bring zinc intracellular, but they're helpful for anti-cancer purposes too. But beyond that, I think that I've learned so much from use of the cocktail, the hydroxychloroquine cocktail, that I'm convinced that it is a broad spectrum antiviral that's so well tolerated. I see patients now that are acutely ill. They look like they're COVID-19. I treat them. They get better in 24 hours, and then they're COVID negative. So they've had some other virus, another rhinovirus or coronavirus or possibly influenza. And so we've learned a lot about the value of a broad spectrum antiviral that's well tolerated. And I'm a proponent of even making it useful for influenza.
Doctor, by the way, is it Ja or is it Zaha? I've got it. That's how
it's okay, Senator. It's Ja.
Ja, okay. That's what I thought. Just have a different pronunciation. Do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I'd love to. Senator Langford, thank you for your question. So antivirals are tough. As opposed to antibacterial therapy, where we have a broad set of antibiotics, antivirals take a long time to develop. It took us about 15 years to develop antivirals that were really effective for HIV. It's taken us a long time to develop them for hepatitis C and hepatitis B. And we don't have good ones for most outpatient viruses. You know, if you think about the common cold, which thankfully isn't fatal, but can make you feel pretty lousy for a couple of days, we don't have good treatments for those things outside of supportive therapy like Tylenol or other things that just help manage the symptoms. They are difficult to develop. I think we all agree, I mean, there's no question on this panel or among the entire medical community that finding early therapies for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is absolutely critical. It would make an enormous difference. And I had actually been early on very hopeful that hydroxychloroquine might be one of those things. It would change the course of this disease. It just hasn't panned out. And there is a lot of work going on. There are a lot of things being studied, and I think we should continue studying them. And when the evidence says that something works, we should use it. And when it doesn't, we shouldn't.
All right, that's very helpful. One more quick question in the minute that I have left here. There's a lot of hope out there because of the vaccines that are coming. Obviously, we have 2 vaccines that are on the horizon quickly that could be here by the end of the year with pending FDA final approval in this process. We have 4 more in the queue at this point. That hope is one of the misinformation pieces that's out there publicly is, hey, be scared because this was a fast developed vaccine, and so you should be frightened of it. I don't share that from what I've seen with my own oversight. I'm pleased that there's been no shortcut in the science and the process on this, and it's gone through all of the studies and such on it. Does anyone here have any concern on the vaccines that are coming at all, that they have not gone through the proper science?
I would say absence of a response means nobody has a concern.
That's what I would take that as well. I'm pleased to be able to hear that, and look forward to those vaccines actually coming to market and us moving forward in the days ahead. Gentlemen, thank you for your opinions. I appreciate your insight.
Senator Carper.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, colleagues, and to our guests today, our witnesses, we thank you all for joining us. Thank you for what you do with your lives. About 8 months ago, almost to the day, our president said these words. He said, "It's going to disappear one day. It's like a miracle. It will disappear." That was February 27th, or earlier this year. And since that time, we've suffered the loss of 250,000 people in this country. As of this week, 250,000. There, somebody's mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, aunt, uncle, child, nephew, niece. 250,000 of them. I have my colleagues have heard me say this rhetorical question. Compared to what? Well, compared to Taiwan, 7. Compared to South Korea, 498. Compared to Singapore, 28. Compared to New Zealand, 25. Compared to Australia, 907. Compared to Japan, 1908. Compared to China, 4,500. India, 132,000. Canada, 11,000. 11,000. Mexico, 99,000. You add all those numbers up, we've actually suffered more deaths since the beginning of this year from coronavirus than all those other countries combined. More than 4 times the number of men and women who died in the Vietnam War where I served. More than 4 times. And it's been all year long, this has been an opportunity for us to, instead of being divided by this against one another, arguing about stuff, we ought to be done a better job of figuring out how to deal with it. And we should be guided by science. Every now and then I hear a song on the radio, an old song, One Hit Wonder, Thomas Dolby. And his one hit was, "She Blinded Me with Science." And I've always said, we ought to be not blinded by science, but guided by science. And as we can hear here today, there's not absolute agreement on science, unfortunately. But there's one thing that we I hope can agree on. We need a vaccine, and we need a battle. We need a vaccine, we need a couple of vaccines if at all possible. We need for them to work. We need to be able to reach out to people who are afraid to take any vaccine, including 2 that are 95% effective. We need to be able to message to American people in weeks and months to come so that when the vaccine is available, people will take it. Right now, about half the people in this country say they wouldn't take it. We have to make sure that when it's available in great quantities, that almost everyone will be willing to take it. And the second thing that we need to do is to figure out, with a country of a couple of 300 million people living in, how do we get the vaccine distributed and administered to the people most in need? How do we make sure they don't just get 1 shot, but they get 2 shots? How do we do that? How do we keep track? And do it in a way that increases the confidence of the American people in our ability to deal with this. I would just suggest, as interesting as this hearing is today, what I think, Mr. Chairman, to our ranking member, I would just urge us to focus the hearing on maybe in December, certainly in January, that actually focuses on how do we actually convince the American people that the vaccines are going to be safe, that they ought to take them, and that the second thing, how do we figure out the distribution system to be able to administer that vaccine successfully and quickly, effectively. want to ask a question, if I could, of Dr. Jha. Dr. Jha, right? Dr. Jha? Yes, thank you. Not a big name. People must struggle with it. Great to see you. Dr. Jha, you've talked today about the need for detailed vaccine distribution plans, public education campaigns to reverse universally high levels of vaccine hesitancy among Americans. I just referred to that. What steps do we need to take now to ensure that states have what they need in financial, logistical, and technological support to provide COVID-19 vaccines to every American who wants to be vaccinated?
Yeah, Senator Carper, thank you for that really important question. This pandemic is going to come to an end in 2021, or let us just say we will bring it under control in 2021, and we will do it through highly effective vaccines if they are widely distributed and accepted by the American people, right? Because the old line that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. And there are many steps between a vaccine becoming available and Americans getting vaccinated. I think there are two broad sets of issues that really need addressing. First is getting states ready to receive the vaccines, to distribute the vaccines, to have a clear game plan for who gets it first, who gets it second, what the protocols are going to be and how it's going to be distributed. Those are critical issues. I'm talking to state health departments around the country, and there's a lot of confusion and lack of clarity about exactly how all of this is going to work. I think that needs to be dealt with effectively soon. Yesterday would have been a good day. Today's better. We got to get going on that. But the other part that goes beyond distribution is the communicating with the American people about this. And I think where the other panelists and I may disagree about the value of science and scientific evidence for hydroxychloroquine, we all agree, everybody I know agrees, that the scientific process behind the vaccines has been done with incredible integrity. And we've got to communicate that to the American people. We've got to bring in trusted voices, religious leaders, civil society leaders, political leaders, to voice that information and help people understand and answer their questions about the vaccine. If we do all of that, I believe that Americans will be open to getting vaccinated, and most of them will step up to be vaccinated, and that's how we're going to bring this pandemic under control.
Thank you. Dr. Jha, a follow-on question. Minority populations are understandably skeptical about government-run campaigns on mass vaccination. Surveys indicate that minority populations demonstrate significantly higher hesitancy than white Americans in receiving COVID-19 vaccine. How should federal, state, and local governments work with these communities, these minority communities, to improve their awareness and acceptance of potential vaccines?
Yeah, this is a really critical issue, Senator. There's a long history of distrust born out of some very, very troubling practices that have been directed towards minority communities. So these areas of concern are not born out of nothing. I believe the best way to engage members of communities of color is through direct sharing of information, through openness and transparency, and through engagement of trusted voices. Because while the message is important, the messenger is every bit as much so. And so that does mean, in my mind, reaching out to religious leaders and political and civil society leaders in those communities, working through the evidence and data with them so they feel comfortable becoming advocates. Of course, we have to still do other things, like make sure that we deal with financial barriers and eliminate them, and other logistical things to make it easier. But it's really a combination of both those logistical financial issues, but also really getting trusted voices to address these things. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, and to a ranking member, thank you for convening us. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks very much to Dr. Jha for those responses. I would again urge us, maybe as early as next month, to begin a series of hearings that focus on communicating, messaging to particular populations that are reluctant to take the vaccine. When half the people in this country say they're not going to take any vaccine, we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, Senator Carper, I'm
100 million people to distribute to. That's a lot of work to do, and we need to work together to get it done.
Well, Senator Carper, appreciate your questioning here. And I'm happy to hold a follow-on hearing. I'm happy to schedule it right away. But I will say that I've heard it now said repeatedly that we've got to convince the American public that the vaccines are safe. I don't recall anybody on my side of the aisle questioning the safety of the vaccine process. That seems to have been coming from elected officials on the other side of the aisle in your presidential and vice presidential candidates. So if we have to repair the damage of the credibility of people's confidence in the vaccine, it's not because of what Republicans have said. I'm sorry to say partisan. It's what folks on your side of the aisle said. With that, Senator Hassan.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say, this is not a Democrat versus Republican issue.
You've made it that. Senator Hassan.
We got to work together. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just checking my sound. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Thank you. And thanks to our witnesses for being here today. Thanks to the chairman and ranking member Peters for holding this hearing. But I would like to just start by expressing my deep concern over the president's decision to fire Director Krebs of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Director Krebs and his cybersecurity team helped protect our election infrastructure from cyber threats. Moreover, they did an admirable job of combating the plague of disinformation that some sought to push in order to undermine our election process, the bedrock of our democracy. Director Krebs' leadership at CISA is to be commended, and his firing is unwarranted, and it makes our country less safe. The director's firing and the future of CISA would be a more appropriate topic for a hearing in this committee than what we are focusing on today. Now, turning to the topic of today's hearing, over the past 2 weeks, we have received encouraging news on potentially promising vaccine candidates. However, even under the best circumstances, researchers suggest that a vaccine will not be widely available until mid-2021. COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, and deaths throughout the country have skyrocketed, and experts agree that we have a very difficult winter ahead of us. The Senate should encourage people to make evidence-based decisions about treatment and care, and take precautions that keep themselves and their families safe, such as practicing social distancing and wearing masks. So I have two questions to Dr. Jha. First, Dr. Jha, as we learn more about how COVID-19 is transmitted in communities across the country, it's becoming increasingly clear that small gatherings with friends and families are driving much of the spread we are currently seeing. It's understandable that people feel comfortable gathering with friends and family who they know and they trust, but I'm concerned that Americans are not getting the information that they need to fully assess risks associated with these types of gatherings. So, Doctor, can you talk specifically about why it appears that these smaller types of gatherings have been such a driver of community spread, and what steps people should be taking to reverse this trend?
Senator Hassan, thank you for that question. And this is, in fact, a really troubling issue because, of course, we are at more than 150,000 infections a day. Hospitals are really starting to get full. And when you look at where a lot of the spread is happening, as you said, Senator, a lot of it is happening in people's homes. The reason is what we know about this virus at this point is that spread happens when people gather indoors and are not wearing masks. That's the major risk factor for spread. Now, it's been a long pandemic already, and a lot of people are tired. Yeah. And there is a sense that your home is your safe place. And I understand that sense. But when you invite friends and family, you again make the assumption that they are safe. And I understand that. The problem is that there is so much asymptomatic spread of this virus. There's so many people who spread the virus without even feeling any symptoms at all. When you bring friends over, you get together, you have a meal, you share some drinks, and eventually, obviously, the masks come off and people get close because those are natural patterns that feel normal to us. And that has become a major source of spread of this virus, leading to a lot of infections and deaths. Beyond better communication, really stopping the disinformation and stopping the undermining of science, I think at this point, the critical issues really are about telling people where the risks are and helping people make better decisions. This is not forever. This is really for the next few months until we have a vaccine.
Well, thank you. I want to follow up on this. The risks associated with the pandemic have led millions of Americans to make the difficult decision to adjust Thanksgiving celebrations and other holiday gatherings. Many others, however, are still struggling to determine whether there's a way to travel or celebrate safely. So what advice do you have for those who remain uncertain about whether to travel over the Thanksgiving holiday?
Yeah, Senator, this is one I have struggled with myself. You know, during Thanksgiving, we usually get together either with my in-laws or my own elderly parents. And I thought a lot about, is there a way to do it safely? And have concluded I can't figure out how to do that safely. As much as I would love to see my family, my extended family for Thanksgiving, I also want them around in 2021. And I believe that household gatherings of people who are not part of your nuclear family, who don't live at home with you, is just very, very hard to do safely right now. And so I have come to the unfortunate conclusion that I'm recommending to people that people not do that. They can get together outdoors if that's possible, go for walks, spend time outdoors with masks, but indoor gatherings, the traditional Thanksgiving family meal, just don't know how to do that safely this year.
My family is making similar determinations. The usual group of 30 of us who gather is not going to be what we're doing this year. Let me follow up with you. For those who will be hosting gatherings, if they do feel it's necessary for some reason, what specific accommodations and modifications to their normal plans do you believe are essential to help mitigate the risk of transmission over the holidays?
Yeah, so there are things that can be done to lower the risk. In some places of the country, it may be possible to do it outside, and that would make an enormous difference. Keeping the number of people minimum or small would be helpful. If you can keep windows open, have people wearing masks most of the time, sit somewhat separate for meals, none of this feels like a normal Thanksgiving. But this is not a normal Thanksgiving. We're in the worst pandemic in a century. And the key here is, while we want to enjoy a normal Thanksgiving, what we really want is our family and friends around in 2021 so we can celebrate with them once the pandemic really gets under control.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your work and your advice. My family will be Zooming while we eat, which is it's going to be our way of sharing the meal. But thank you again for all you're doing to help keep Americans informed and safe. And Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Hassan. Dr. McCullough has been wanting to be recognized. So I'll give you a minute before I turn it over to Senator Enzi.
Senators, listening to that last exchange of questions and answers, I want my testimony to be clear. This entire hearing was about early treatment. And what those last set of exchanges showed, a complete lack of focus. It went over to the vaccine, and then now wandered over to wearing masks and even what's being offered at the Thanksgiving dinner. One of the reasons why America is failing colossally in handling the pandemic is a lack of focus exemplified by the last series of exchanges.
Understand.
And Mr. Chair, I will just say that I think it's critically important that accurate information get out to the American people about what the best science tells us about avoiding getting the disease in the first place and taking precautions to keep our loved ones safe. That was the purpose of my questions, and I thank you for holding this hearing.
Sure. I appreciate that. What I have found, though, is, because I've heard the term disinformation thrown around in this hearing a lot, I know oftentimes those accusing somebody of doing something are even more guilty of doing exactly what they're accusing others of. And I'll use the disinformation as an example. I was accused repeatedly of accepting and then disseminating Russian disinformation. I did no such thing. Completely false allegation, when in fact it was Senator Peters and his staff that introduced Russian disinformation into our investigatory records. So I just get a little tired of hearing all the accusations coming from the other side that, on the credibility of the vaccine. It's not Republicans that are questioning the validity of the science on the vaccines, the credibility of it. It's Democrats, and I need to put that on the record. Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. It's a different hearing than anything that I've seen, and critically needed. Dr. Jad, I want to thank you for the positive comments about the speed of the process for a vaccine. We seldom hear that. We never hear that from the other side. When the media wants a person to fail, there's a little recourse. And if this had happened in a non-election year, it might be totally different. Politics has played a role in this. One of my first introductions to any kind of a pandemic was with AIDS, and I remember President Bush shocking all of us at a State of the Union speech when he said, we're going to spend $15 billion to solve the problem of AIDS in Africa and around the world. Now, back then, 15 billion was a lot of money. Not anymore. But as a result, I got to be involved in that process. And after it passed the House and the Senate unanimously, unamended, they sent me to Africa to see what the problem was. I got to meet with some traditional healers. We'd probably call them medicine men. Most powerful person in a tribe, because they can poison the chief and do their own autopsy. But I asked them what they'd learned about AIDS, and they said, well, we now know that we shouldn't bleed two people with the same knife. I don't think bleeding people was an acceptable method of solving the problems of the people that were infected. But at any rate, if this had happened in a non-election year, I think it would have been different. I really appreciate you holding a hearing on what people can do when they first find out that maybe they're infected. That's always when we've tried to do something. Even with critical things like cancer, early treatment has been important. We haven't had any discussions on early treatment. I appreciate all this information on early treatment. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. That's with everything that we know about when you get sick. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But when people are thinking that maybe they're going to die, they'd like to have some kind of a solution. They'd be willing to try some things. But obviously good news doesn't sell because you won't see it anywhere. And people aren't looking for next year's answer, they're looking for this year's answer. And yes, they're trying to figure out how they can get together for Thanksgiving. My family's trying to figure that out. And I see a real state of panic, mostly because they think that until the vaccine comes out, there is no answer. So thank you for answers of what can be done. And as far as studies, actual use is probably a pretty good study. And Dr. Fareed, could you repeat once more what this cocktail is that you've been using and what the results have been?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The cocktail developed from the work of Dr. Rao and Solanco, that were our heroes, consists of hydroxychloroquine. It's the actual algorithm now that is promulgated by the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons presents the details, but our cocktail may be a little bit different, and there is flexibility. It consists of hydroxychloroquine that we found 100% effective, 3,200 milligrams over a 5-day period, and then doxycycline, 100 milligrams twice a day for 5 to 7 days, or azithromycin, 500 milligrams once a day for 5 days, and zinc. That's extremely important. We've been giving a rather high dose, but it's very well tolerated. 50 milligrams 3 times a day for that 5-day period. So that's it. It's simple, and it's extremely well tolerated.
Now, how can people get these early intervention drugs? Are they strictly prescription? Are they, how would you go about it? How would you get your doctor to prescribe it if that's necessary?
The doctor prescribes hydroxychloroquine, and there's a growing acceptance among pharmacies to dispense it. There was quite a problem early on because of the stigma that was applied to it and misunderstandings. But in any case, the hydroxychloroquine is a prescription agent in the United States. In other countries, it's over the counter. And there are countries now that are dispensing packets that they take home, that they provide off the shelf to contain all the components, including this ivermectin. That's another attractive agent for anti-COVID purposes. But if they don't have the hydroxychloroquine, they can take the flavonoid like quercetin or EGCG that are antioxidants that help bring zinc in the cell, and that's what actually is an antiviral component of the treatment, one of them. But the quercetin can be taken 3 times a day, and that's over the counter. 500 milligrams 3 times a day during the acute infection. But it's much more effective using the agent that has multiple actions as an antiviral, hydroxychloroquine.
Dr. McCullough, would you be willing to provide us with a copy of that chart that you have?
Yeah, let me just state
And
that
to comment on this?
the word science has been used multiple times in the hearing. In medicine, we have a fair scientific process of vetting, and that's called peer-reviewed publication. What I'm holding up is a peer-reviewed publication of a treatment algorithm that was fully vetted by a journal listed in the National Library of Medicine. The first version was in the American Journal of Medicine. This updated version will appear in the Proceedings of the Baylor University Medical Center. So this is the best available science. And as a doctor, the accumulation of a doctor's career on science is actually their publication record. And at this hearing, I hold the senior publication record. Dr. Xi, the minority witness, has never published on the treatment of COVID-19 at home. There is evidence to support each and every one of these components. I would say, in addition to Dr. Fareed, because you look like you're older and maybe a patient that would be in my practice as a cardiologist, I can tell you that it's likely, in addition to what he mentioned, you would get to the second or third levels of the protocol, which would involve the use of steroids as well as blood thinners. So for my patients who have heart or lung disease, kidney disease, who are ill, typically in their 70s and 80s, it's going to involve 4 prescription drugs, all of which have support from the scientific evidence. And what the hearing is, this is a call for not just a small group of innovative doctors and researchers, but for the broad medical community. We've got 1 million doctors and 500,000 nurse practitioners sitting on the sidelines right now. Their patients are calling them, and they're saying, we don't know what to do. The government's telling us to do nothing. We don't treat COVID. And we're building up to mass panic in the United States. I don't hear a sense of urgency on this committee call at all. We are weeks away from mass panic and massive mortality. People are talking about Thanksgiving dinner. Come on, there are so many infected people now. Labs are hitting 20% positive rates. That means the number of people coming to the lab that are testing positive is 20%. And the average person infects many more people. This is a massive calamity that's right around the corner. And I'm pleading for the Senate in America right now, in between administrations, which is a very vulnerable time, to not absolutely get clobbered with a tsunami of mortality, particularly for our elder citizens.
I know I've run over, but I think I'm the last person. So I'd like to ask Dr. Risch a question. We've talked about...
You're not the last person.
Yeah, I realize that, but I'll give him another minute here.
Sorry. Dr. Risch, is there any of these kind of studies about the effect of blood thinners? If people are on blood thinners already, or they have less incidence of having COVID?
That's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with familiar with studies of existing patients. I have seen one hospital-based study of a difference in benefit between regular heparin as an anticoagulant and another drug, enoxaparin. And then enoxaparin showed a 2/3 reduction in mortality in this one study. So it's promising to look at. I don't know whether it would be useful in regular use as outpatients. The clotting mechanism is complicated in COVID, and we're not really fully on top of it. And so we try a number of different medications for anticoagulation, including aspirin.
I can follow up on that and just enter into the record Billett, B-I-L-L-E-T-T, et al. 2020, 3625 patients who were treated with low molecular weight heparin or novel anticoagulant drugs. There was a 50% relative risk reduction for mortality. So blood thinners in high-risk patients, in fact, we've published on this. There is a stratification that we can identify who is more likely to need these blood thinners, and they are older patients with heart and lung disease, and there's a dramatic benefit. So early sequence multi-drug therapy is not all about hydroxychloroquine, and it's not all about the virus. It's handling the complications that the virus creates.
Could I just
Thank
mention
you all
also,
for your
in our protocol, we start the patient on aspirin, enteric-coated aspirin at the beginning, 325 milligram every day, and that's found to be very helpful for prevention of a coagulation problem.
Thank you all for your positive answers.
Well, Senator Enzi, thanks for attending the hearing. And you know, as I've spoken in conference, I've been pushing early intervention, early treatment, whatever it is, whatever works, because to me that was going to always be the key component of ending this COVID crisis. And we've ignored it. And it's baffled me, and I'll just point out again, maybe part of the reason is the hydroxychloroquine cocktail, it's about $20, right? Certainly no more than 50. Remdesivir, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the side effects of that and the studies, the science behind that, costs over $3,000. Could that maybe be one of the reasons why all the effort is put on these more exotic therapeutics that cost thousands of dollars versus something that's off the shelf that costs $20? Something to consider. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the physicians here for the, I know that your dedication, the reason you went into medicine, your dedication and care and commitment to your patients and to their recovery is, I can hear it, I can feel it, and I'm happy for the robust discussion. But one thing that I would like to bring up that I think is key to possible early treatment is robust testing. And so I want to talk about our at-home testing options, because this could be a critical component before you wait to have some more difficult symptoms, because COVID-19, it's, of course, like you said, spreading rapidly. We're about to hit the holiday seasons. These are events, a highly contagious disease, and we need to do more on a federal level to support testing, prevention, and the treatment options, and some things that we can deliver at home that perhaps you can then be on the lookout if your symptoms begin to get more difficult, or if you have some other underlying, of course, comorbidities that may contribute to your a bad outcome for this disease. So Dr. Jha, could you please speak to how widely available a rapid at-home test might change the way that people access tests, and how it might change the way that doctors can do early intervention, depending on whether you have cardiac issues or other issues, asthma, whatever that may be. We know FDA just announced this week of the prescription at-home test. It's positive news, but how close are we to other types of saliva tests that people might be able to do themselves over the counter and help us get treatment for everyone? Dr. Jha.
Yeah, Senator Rosen, thank you for that really important question. There are many things we could have really done to change the trajectory of this pandemic. And one of them certainly would have been if we could have made widespread home testing available. If those tests were available, it would allow people to self-quarantine, and so they wouldn't be infecting others. It would allow people to seek early therapies. One of the key points of this entire hearing is about early treatment. Early treatment is only possible if you get an early diagnosis. And our testing infrastructure really is no longer managing to be able to provide that. Now, I'm heartened by the Lucira EUA from the FDA. It's really the first true home test, and it's going to be months before it's widely available, and it's going to be through a prescription only. What many of us have been calling for is towards new technologies that are emerging and available that would allow for widespread availability of home tests that would make a tremendous difference, and they would be much, much cheaper. That hasn't happened. I believe we have the technology to do it, and we need those tests, but that's going to be a critical part of controlling this pandemic.
Well, I hope that this Congress, maybe in one of our packages, we could fund that, because I do think that that would really help us. Just give us another tool in the toolbox to tamp down the disease. Another thing that I want to talk about as far as treatment, but treatment also takes healthcare workers, right? Across the medical spectrum, from people who administer the test, read the test, analyze it, phlebotomists to technicians and highly skilled physicians. And so I want to talk about our healthcare capacity, our role of our caregivers in their in this mix. And so I know I have a lot of bipartisan bills that provide tax credits, training, and support caregivers, and others that also support increasing our medical infrastructure, our provider shortages, like our Conrad 30 program, extra GME slots, federal funding for rural areas to improve nursing. So, of course, all of this, more tools in the toolbox. Many people, we see our healthcare system kind of buckling under. And so what kind of investments would you hope that we might put forward in a future COVID package to support training across the medical spectrum to deliver vaccines and treatments and services and all of that? Because you can't do it without support, right? Pharmacists, you name it. So if you could address that, I think that's also key too.
So, Senator Rosen, absolutely. The healthcare system, we often think about it as hospitals and doctors' offices and pharmacies. But what it really is nurses and doctors and pharmacists who work in these places. And in fact, one of the things I've been very worried about is we're not paying enough attention to the healthcare workforce right now. For instance, when we think about hospital capacity in the middle of this surge, we often say, well, that hospital has plenty of beds available. Those beds aren't going to do anybody any good if there isn't a nurse to take care of a patient in that bed, if there isn't a physician to take care of that patient. So we have not been paying enough attention to healthcare workers. I think that point is absolutely critical, and I think finding ways of supporting them. Obviously, a critical thing is we need to make sure they're protected through PPEs, but there are more things that we could be doing. And then when I think about the distribution challenges, we've all talked about the incredible vaccines that are coming and the importance of getting them out quickly. We're going to want to vaccinate hundreds of millions of Americans over the next 6 months. They're going to have to be done in all sorts of places, including pharmacies, including doctors' offices, hospitals. We have to find ways of training and supporting these workers who can actually deliver these kinds of services. So in any package that supports the healthcare system, thinking about the healthcare workers first and then really making sure that they're getting what they need is absolutely central to the success of such a package.
Well, thank you. I see that I have just about a minute left because I'm trying to think about all the support systems for early detection, for treatment, for vaccines, whatever that is. I also think about in our community, my community, and of course communities across the country, families are struggling economically. And that means increased food insecurity, and those other kinds of existential things that families need in order to stay healthy, even to get to a doctor in case they don't have health care, they've lost their job. I mean, we have our food banks, our 3 Square Food Bank of Northern Nevada, United Ways across the country doing that. And so can you talk about some of the things that people should be able to do in their home? We talk about whether maybe vitamin supplements, other things that people might take. They're not even able to purchase those if they don't have a job. They may not even be able to put food on the table. That contributes to bad health outcomes too. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, I'll say, Senator Rosen, that a critical part of this response is getting people through this time period. We've seen very, very long lines at food banks. We've seen people going to work in dangerous situations because they don't have any choice, because they've got to put food on the table. And in the middle of the biggest public health crisis of a century, I think all of us agree that helping people through this time period, we're not talking about forever, we're not talking about for years, we're really now talking about the next 3 to 6 months as the critical period, making sure people have enough food, making sure people have access to health care. Those are central because if people don't, people are going to make tough choices that will make the whole pandemic worse and really leave everybody worse off, certainly leave those individuals worse off. So any comprehensive strategy on pandemic preparedness and response needs to take into issues exactly the ones that you have laid out.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I've gone over my time as well, but I like to think of it, we don't live in a vacuum, so there's other things that are going to help us succeed, and I want to be sure that we look at those, so whatever treatments are right, whatever vaccines, that we're prepared to have everyone get them and be able to get through this pandemic together as a country. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Rosen. I've got a number of questions that I'll continue to ask. I think the point about testing, I think everybody agrees it would have been great to have hundreds of millions of tests available day one, but it's just not practical. It didn't happen. This isn't Star Trek where you just say computer, 300 million tests. So it's taken time. What didn't necessarily have to take time was using off-the-shelf drugs for early treatment. But yet somehow, I guess it's because President Trump allowed the word hydroxychloroquine to flow off out of his mouth, all of a sudden that was attacked and that was poisoned. And we never, ever had the NIH, CDC, FDA put their full weight behind an investigation of that. The full clinical trials. I was pushing for that. Not pushing hydroxychloroquine, pushing for the science, for studies. But it never happened because, again, it was censored. We talked about disinformation. Not providing the public information is disinformation as well. So again, why I fault the agencies is because they turned a blind eye toward simple, cheap, possibly effective treatments that, by the way, created no harm. Dr. Risch, I think you mentioned, and I've got a lot to go over here. You mentioned that the non-randomized trials, I guess we'd call that observational studies, real-world experience, really involving thousands of patients, indicated that there was a 50% reduction in hospitalization deaths. In the Saudi Arabian study, 5-time reduction. Now let's just assume that that's true. I think we can also take a look at the billions of doses a year that are prescribed with hydroxychloroquine. Any member of Congress who's gone to Africa, they've just been handed hydroxychloroquine as an anti-malarial. We treat lupus, we treat rheumatoid arthritis. We don't give EKGs before that. The studies I saw early on were designed to fail on hydroxychloroquine, late in treatment, when people were basically ready to die, or when their heart was already affected by the virus. Of course, hydroxychloroquine does have an impact on arrhythmia at that late stage, but not early, which is when it was being recommended for early use, first 5 days. So when you take a look at the risk-reward, now that these other observational non-randomized studies have been conducted, 50% or 5-fold reduction in death and hospitalization versus the almost infinitesimal risk of hydroxychloroquine and zinc, this has made no sense to me whatsoever. The only explanation is the politicization of it, which I opened up my opening comments saying that has been what's such a shame. I do want to, before I forget, I received a letter and an article from the Economic Standard submitted by Dr. Stephen Hatfill. The letter kind of explains what I have known about a whistleblower, Dr. Rick Bright, who was asked by his superiors to work on establishing an FDA expanded access investigational new drug protocol. But by his insubordination, he instead went to Janet Woodcock and people in the FDA and got the emergency use authorization, which sounds like, hey, we're going to expand the use of this. No, he dramatically restricted the use of hydroxychloroquine only in hospital, when I think we all recognize it's probably not particularly effective, possibly dangerous, and only out of the national stockpile. He knew what he was doing. That's what poisoned the well. That's what created what I've called the prescription logjam here on hydroxychloroquine or early, and I think it affected all early treatment options. It took them off the table. We took our eye off the ball. That's why I say our agencies failed us. These individuals in these agencies failed us. And here's the question I want to ask for you, Dr. McCullough, because you mentioned this. The circle of empathy. Can you just talk about how you described that to me before the hearing?
Let me just say, before I answer that this is not just a government culpability and malfeasance with respect to hydroxychloroquine. This is academic malfeasance. There were 2 fraudulent papers, one in the New England Journal of Medicine, one in Lancet, published by individuals interested in doing evil to the world with respect to a beneficial treatment of hydroxychloroquine. In an unprecedented manner, these two manuscripts were withdrawn after 2 weeks where they could scare the public and the world's physician audience. Since that time, there have been dozens of fraudulent papers.
Reemphasize that. They were then withdrawn.
They were withdrawn, and the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet acknowledged that they were fraudulent papers. They were scare papers to scare people on hydroxychloroquine. Since that time, there's been dozens of pile-on scare tactics in academics. This isn't the government. This is people in my field, in academic medicine, who are committing academic fraud. I reviewed a paper. I'm a cardiologist. I reviewed a paper that made it into the medical literature demonstrating that hydroxychloroquine causes a heart attack, that hydroxychloroquine causes a giant scar in the heart. And I can tell you, I'm at Baylor in Dallas. We have the world's most recognized cardiac pathology program in the world. Our senior examiner has held in his hands, more human hearts than anybody in the history of mankind. I can tell you firsthand, hydroxychloroquine does not cause giant scars in the heart. So academic medicine is committing a fraud, is committing, I think, a crime against humanity. There must be a motivation behind this that's much bigger than just Democrat versus Republican. I am extremely concerned, honestly, about the academic contribution to scare tactics in the world. Now, it's not working everywhere. In India, it's given first line. And India is such a crowded country. I've been there myself. Their deaths per million population is a tiny fraction of America. If you're in Greece,
isn't it 95 versus over 700?
Yeah, so we have,
and they're using hydroxychloroquine.
Right, we have nearly 800 deaths per million population in the United States, and we're all spread out. In India, they're on top of each other. They have less than 100 deaths per million population. The leading doctor in India is willing to come testify to the United States and tell you the reason why. They have tons of COVID. It's spreading over like crazy, but they're treating it at home with hydroxychloroquine and other drugs. Remember, it's a multi-drug program, probably about four or so drugs plus supplements, and they've handled the infection. Greece, everyone's been traveled in Europe. Greece is not a third world country. First line, you're given hydroxychloroquine. Okay? We've missed the ball. There's 30 countries that have approved an oral version of remdesivir called favipiravir. 30 countries, including Japan. Every country that is actually having a reasonable public health response is treating this problem at home. Now, none of these drugs are a cure, but they allow the patient to get through the illness. Like myself, I missed 10 days off of work and I returned to the workforce. I didn't get in the hospital for 4 weeks. They allow people to stay at home and not go out and contaminate other people. My wife and I got it at the same time, and because we were treated at home, we were actually able to stay at home so we didn't contaminate other people. The current program that's supported by the Minority Witness and the National Institutes of Health and all government bodies is that patients go home, they get no help whatsoever, doctors are not supposed to treat them, they go out in a panic to urgent cares and ERs, contaminate more people, and then they're hospitalized and die. America has to wake up right here, right now. We are getting buried, and we need home treatment.
Okay, Dr. Jha, let me have you jump in here. We've got Dr. McCullough, again, Vice Chair of Medicine at Baylor, I believe Harvard trained. Dr. Harvey Risch, trained at Yale. Dr. Freed, Harvard trained. Completely different assessment of literatures and study versus what you're talking about, and you say it with a great deal of authority. Well, let me first, what is your opinion of these three gentlemen in front of us, these three doctors? I mean, this is not pejorative to you three gentlemen. Do you think they're just idiots? Again, you are very authoritative and completely refuting what these three gentlemen are talking about. I mean, this is the disconnect, and this is what America needs to evaluate. Okay?
Yep.
So tell me what your opinion of these three gentlemen are here.
Yeah. So, Senator Johnson, I don't know these three gentlemen. They're all clearly well qualified. They're clearly smart, and I believe they're all clearly committed to the right issues. I have no reasons to doubt any of that. My problem here is not so much that we have a differing reading of the literature, which we clearly do. It is this idea that there is this broad conspiracy across, hundreds of thousands of doctors, the NIH, the CDC, all academic institutions, the Infectious Disease Society of America. We're all in on this conspiracy to prevent Americans from getting a life-saving therapy. As you might imagine, pulling off a conspiracy like that would be extremely difficult. Doctors and academics are way too disorganized to pull off such a thing.
By the way, I never use the word conspiracy.
I understand, Senator.
I don't think anybody else. So quit using that word.
Okay, fair enough.
Something has happened where we have not devoted any time or energy or resources to doing what could have stopped this COVID crisis very quickly, and that's called early intervention, early treatment. Okay.
Yeah. So Senator, I agree, and I will not use the word conspiracy, and I apologize if that was at all offensive. I didn't mean it to be. The point is, we have tried. There are ongoing randomized controlled trials of outpatient therapy. And what I have said literally from March, when this issue first came up, and I have a long track record on this, is I hope this works. I pray it works. If it works, it's going to make a massive difference. The literature on this, it's not like no one has studied this. We've had multiple randomized trials, including some in the outpatient setting. They just haven't worked.
But again, that is just so okay. So that's disputed. In your testimony, you came up, and I'm telling you, this is, I consider disinformation a scare tactic. 93% increase in reports of poisoning, and then you heard what Dr. McCullough talked about. We're talking about out of about 500,000 people that took hydroxychloroquine, another 77 called in, and about 2/3 of that was because they thought they maybe took an extra dose and they were concerned about it. So again, you use a scare tactic of saying 93% increase in poison of hydroxychloroquine when it's not even, it's an infinitesimal impact, but it's a enormous, and I would call it disinformation impact in terms of your communication.
Can I just have a chance to respond to that? First of all, I have never made the claim that this is the problem with hydroxychloroquine.
You made the claim that it was unsafe in your testimony.
Sir, yeah, I agree. Let me just finish that thought. I did mention the 93% because it is correct. I could have mentioned the fact that there have been more than 76,000 instances of toxicity reported to the WHO across the world from hydroxychloroquine during the middle of this pandemic. The bottom line is that every drug has some safety issues, including hydroxychloroquine. If it's effective, we should use it. To me, that is not the most compelling issue. Most of my testimony was about the effectiveness. Yes, I did throw in a statistic, which turns out to be correct, and I could use others, but I don't think we should focus excessively on that. I think we should focus on the fact that the evidence so far is very clear that this therapy doesn't work. If future data show that it does, I will be delighted and be the first to promote it, but I've got to be driven by the data and the science and not what I hope is to be true.
Well, again, there's a real dispute by the 4 members of this panel. I realize I selected 3 and Senator Peters selected you, but there's a real dispute. And by the way, these aren't the only 3 people that take a look at the potential risk-reward ratio here. Take a look at the observational success, the first-hand knowledge of treating people with success, and realize, really the risk-reward ratio would be in favor of give it a shot. And let me make this point, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Peters. I see he's back on screen here. I think me, as a human being, as an American citizen, with the freedom, with a bill that I helped pass now, right to try, should have the right to access this without the interference of bureaucrats in the CDC, NIH, and the FDA. And that is exactly what's happened. I can't get it. Millions of Americans can't access it because of the disinformation, the scaremongering, and the prescription logjam that has been created by bureaucrats. So you can sit back and go, oh, but it hasn't been proven effective. Well, they've never pushed trials to really analyze it. And I've got some pretty eminent people in front of me that have looked at the observational data and completely dispute that. Now, you can sit there with all the authoritative voice that you possibly have, but we've got some gentlemen here that are treating patients, are within that empathy circle, and they completely disagree with you. I'll turn it over to Senator Peters. Oops. Dropped off. Dr. Jha, you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I do, sir. Look, I think you can say, well, I disagree with Dr. Risch, and we have a disagreement. The way I generally tend to adjudicate these things, so I will read the literature and I will form an opinion. But one of the questions I ask myself is, am I missing the boat on this? It's always possible that any one of us can be wrong. At that point, I look to consensus opinion among experts. I go, for instance, on infectious disease issues like this, I will go to the Infectious Disease Society of America, because they are made up of our leading infectious disease experts. IDSA does not recommend the use of hydroxychloroquine for outpatient therapy for COVID-19, and they recommend against it for inpatient therapy. I will turn to agencies like the National Academy of Medicine. I will turn to the National Institutes for Health. I will listen to people like Dr. Francis Collins. The point is that the idea is that these are all individuals with incredible expertise looking at the data. So could it be that I am wrong and Dr. Risch is right? Well, sure, people can disagree. But when you look at the broad consensus in the American scientific community, basically the scientific consensus is very clear that hydroxychloroquine is not effective. Now, when we have looked at it in the outpatient setting, and I started with this in my testimony, we don't have great data on the outpatient setting. We have a small number of studies, but the best one of those show that it doesn't work. Could we get better data? Absolutely. And so, Senator, I would love it if you would push for better quality randomized trials.
By the way, I have, and they wouldn't do it. Okay, I've had a direct pipeline to Dr. Hahn, and I cannot get them to do it, which again begs the question, why not? That's why I say this has been an enormous dereliction. And again, what I would say, you can maybe turn to those different places, but as a patient myself, I wanted to get a hydroxychloroquine, and I couldn't get it. Okay? I think I should have the right to try in dealing with my doctor, who I trust, I'm sorry, more than some of these people who are so outside the circle of empathy, and for whatever reason, again, I'm sorry, it's just me. I question the fact that because this cocktail costs about $20 and remdesivir costs $3,000, that maybe there's a little bias, maybe there's a little conflict, maybe there's a little agenda that's outside of really what's treating a patient when you're in the ivory tower and you're not dealing with sick and dying and ventilated patients. So now I want to talk about remdesivir. On the three of you here, talk about what the study was on remdesivir, how strong a science that is, and what kind of dangerous side effects remdesivir causes, and yet that's the drug that's been pushed. That's the one that got the emergency use authorization. So whichever one of you feel you're most qualified to talk about remdesivir.
I'll just make a few comments to just say that with any one of these randomized trials, even remdesivir, in my view, my judgment of the evidence is that they're all inconclusive. So if you look at remdesivir, in many of the inpatient studies, do you know what the endpoint that they use? They actually use an endpoint that the physician decides. The physician decides how much oxygen the patient needs. And if the patient changes in a grade of oxygen, they change on an ordinal scale. The entire randomized biopharmaceutical complex right now is basically corrupt. So the data on remdesivir are mixed. But I just had a patient die last week, receive remdesivir. The difficulty is it's too toxic. It causes liver toxicity. He had liver toxicity, can't get through the 5-dose administration, and the drug is administered too late. The problem is the virus was replicating 2 weeks ago. By the time that he got into the hospital, the virus has already done its job. So it's a fool's errand to test a single drug like remdesivir late in the illness. This is no different than HIV. We need multiple drugs early up front. And the best we have right now are these mixes of vitamins, supplements, and then the generic medications. The best we have. Now, listen, the NIH just has some oral drugs that they're sponsoring with pharmaceutical trials to move forward. If there's an oral drug tomorrow that can fit into a treatment protocol, it's ready to go. We can plug it right in. The NIH and biopharmaceuticals right now have delivered 0 oral medications to doctors in practice. 0. That's our batting average right now. So for all the science we've put into this as a country with the greatest pharmaceutical companies in the world, 0 oral drugs for the next patient who gets sick with COVID-19.
Isn't it also true that in the study that was being conducted on remdesivir, very late in the trial, because it was showing no improvement in terms of reducing deaths, but it was showing improvement in terms of reduction in number of hospital days, that they actually switched the outcome that they're going to judge the.
Okay, there's so many flaws to the clinical trials that people are looking to. One of the rules is we never change the primary endpoint. The second rule is we have an objective endpoint. The number of days someone stays in the hospital is not objective. That's determined by whether or not the patient feels like they're ready to go home, whether the doctor discharges them, social delays, and everything else. So none of the trials, minority witness says he wants to use the word evidence. Listen, we're at a crisis. We need both the art and the science of medicine. What these doctors are telling you and what the real world evidence is telling you is that patients using a sequenced multi-drug approach at home is the only chance to reduce hospitalization. Remdesivir doesn't prevent a hospitalization because you have to be in the hospital to get it.
One thing I completely agree with Dr. John is the workforce issue. The doctors I'm talking to in Wisconsin say that our hospitals currently aren't being overwhelmed, but they may, based on the uptick, the surge in cases. But the biggest problem they have in hospitals is they don't have the workforce, which again speaks to, had we really put and focused on early treatment and prophylaxis, you might have a more ready workforce. But you've got nurses and doctors that have to stay home because schools are closed. You got to take care of their kids. Again, we have not, from my standpoint, done a very good job of really addressing this in a logical way. It's got to be testing, now it's got to be vaccine, but we are missing, to me, the key ingredient to solving this crisis, which is early effective treatment. We ought to be pouring billions of dollars, but because of the scare tax on hydroxychloroquine, I know, because I talked about, why haven't we done the studies? Because we scared people away from participating in the trials in the U.S. They tried to do a study and they couldn't get people participating. Dr. Risch, can you talk again the difference between a random controlled trial and a non-random or just observational studies or just real-world experience and the validity of all?
So let me start with the last point, real-world experience. After I had published my paper in the American Journal of Epidemiology in May, I got emails from a number of clinicians across the country saying that they had been using hydroxychloroquine very effectively. Now, the criticism of that is those people cherry-picked themselves to tell me that they were doing well, and all the people who weren't doing well didn't report it, and they didn't tell me. So I said to two of them, okay, why don't you go back, keep doing what you're doing, and I'll follow up with you in a month or 6 weeks and see how you've done after that. So we're no longer cherry-picking. We're setting them as test candidates for their treatment plans. And after about 6 weeks, I went back. This was Dr. Zelenko in New York and Dr. Proctor in Texas. And after 6 weeks, what I found is Dr. Zelenko had treated another 400 patients and had no deaths in those, another 400 high-risk patients. He has treated 3,000 patients now, but those were 400 patients since the first time that I talked to him, and no deaths. And Dr. Proctor had at that time about 180 patients subsequent to when I first talked to him, again, and I think he had one death in that. So their real-world evidence is such that no rational person would say, I'm not going to go to them. If I get sick, they'll be the first person that I would go to because they've already proved that they can do this. Whatever it is they're doing, they're magic. Whatever their treatment recipes are, it's working, and they're saving their patients.
Just real quick, you said there was one death. Death from COVID, not from hydroxychloroquine.
It was actually, it's not even clear that it was a death from COVID. The person had a heart attack out of the blue that was unrelated. It was 2 weeks past. They had finished all the treatment, and so he wasn't even sure whether it was related to COVID. But he put it there to be conservative. He put it in, but it's not even clear. It was an elderly man. So that's the first thing. The second part about real-world evidence and non-randomized trials is the only benefit of a randomized trial is if there are some unknown variables that you can't control for. All the known things that you can measure on people, you can adjust for in your study. You can match on in the study, and you can remove them for bias so that you can have a pure treatment between the people who take the drug and the people who don't. It's only the unknown variables. And the reason why these non-randomized but controlled studies have converged to randomized ones is we've learned enough about the diseases that we study that we know what else to measure by and large in every one of them. And so we measure everything in the world and we control for them. And that has removed the so-called unknowns of bias. And this is why there's a difference in non-randomized trials now compared to in the 1950s when we didn't know enough about what to measure and how to control for it. And so that's the second issue, that empirically we know that non-randomized but well-controlled trials work just as well as randomized ones.
Let's talk about.
Let me mention Dr. Proctor's data are submitted and fully under the peer-reviewed process. His spectacular outcomes in suburban Dallas, as Dr. Risch has mentioned.
So I want to talk a little bit about the practice of medicine versus following protocols, which I think we all agree. I mean, if you've got a scientifically based random controlled trial, protocol on treating people, you do it. But not every human body is the same. Not every person is the same, and they don't all react to those protocols, correct? So at that point in time, even with a well-established protocol, doctors have to shift to the art and practice of medicine, correct? And particularly in an epidemic. Dr. Freed, can you talk a little bit about, a little bit more just from layman's terms about how medicine has advanced based on just doctors being doctors and practicing medicine and in an emergency, whether World War II was penicillin or as we were talking about the lower cholesterol lowering drugs, how those doctors using their training, seeing a drug that can do something that with this drug for an improved use over here says, well, it just might work over here. Or I've got a patient where the protocol is not working. I've got to try something. I want to save this patient's life. Can you just kind of talk about, as a practicing physician, how you approach those situations?
Yes, that's so important, particularly when you're on the front line. It was a war. We were at war in this pandemic, and my colleague Dr. Brian Tyson and I took an aggressive approach, and it implied using the art of medicine, of what the principles that we'd learned. And I learned those principles 50 years ago, and I was lucky to have gone to Harvard. I wonder if Dr. Jha actually treats patients, actually the way he talks. But regardless, the issue that I've found to be so important in all my years of practice is to be adaptable, to bring in approaches that I'm recommended from other people and other examples of where there has been a benefit. If it requires in HIV modifying a cocktail to be more effective for a patient to be continually suppressed, or in the COVID situation, it's we've continually found our treatment, this Zelenko type of treatment, to be very effective and reliable, and we adapt it now. When I'm in the hospital seeing patients come in, I don't immediately put them on remdesivir. If it's a mild type of pneumonia that they have, I actually will prescribe our cocktail in the hospital along with convalescent plasma and budesonide inhalation, and those patients walk out in 4 days. So it's important that people be respectful of the options that may be there and use an art in their approach.
So, Dr. Jha, Dr. Freed mentioned you. Do you want to respond? He asked whether you were treating patients.
I do, sir. I've spent the last 20 years taking care of veterans in the VA healthcare system, and recently switched from the Boston VA to the Providence VA. But as a practicing physician, I think a lot about the evidence. I think that my patients want me to give them science-based treatments, and obviously, every patient is different. Obviously, every single time I see a patient, I do think about how to make adjustments. But I'm always guided by the science and evidence. And when there is no science or evidence on something, and if I'm going to think about an off-label use, I'm very careful about that, because the history of medicine is one of often doing more harm than good. And my first oath as a practicing physician was to do no harm. And so I am very much driven by that. And I started off saying that all three of these gentlemen strike me as both smart and committed and caring. I would appreciate a similar sort of respect back. I do take care of patients, and I try to do my best by them. Obviously, I'm not perfect, but I try to use science as well as compassion to guide me.
We appreciate that. Have you treated any COVID patients?
I have not, sir.
Okay. Dr. Fried, you talked about Dr. Rowe. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Dr. Zelenko, you refer to them as heroes. I'm aware of the fact that Dr. Raoult in France is now being prosecuted.
Evidently, that's the case. That's so tragic and inappropriate because he's a high caliber, esteemed doctor in tropical medicine and infectious diseases, and his dedication to his patients is impeccable. So that he guided me. I can only credit him for leading me in the right direction, and Dr. Tyson in our area. So these are men that will be accoladed incredibly when this is all over.
He's being prosecuted right now for using a drug that's been around for 65 years, being prescribed safely without EKGs. Dr. McCullough?
I'm in close communication for this worldwide disaster with many countries, and I can tell you, I did a program with Eamon Matheson at the COVID Medical Network in Australia to show you how off-kilter the world is. In Queensland, Australia, a doctor will be put in jail for prescribing hydroxychloroquine. To show you how, and if you go over to India, they're going to give it to you right away. In Greece, they're going to give it to you right. It's in their guidelines. In Greece,
it's over the counter in some countries,
but my point is, we're all the way from, they give it first line in their guidelines. The Greek guidelines give hydroxychloroquine, but in Queensland, you get put in jail. In the United States, we're caught up in this flurry of data and confusion. Something is going very wrong in this world.
I was contacted by a doctor who I think had written 4 prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine, 4. And she was issued a grand jury subpoena by the Homeland Security Investigation Department, if you can believe that. A doctor prescribing an approved drug, and she gets a grand jury subpoena. Something's not right about that, okay? Now, because I checked into it, they withdrew that subpoena. But there's something that has gone wrong here. There's something that is not right. And I, for one, intend to get to the bottom of it. So, again, gentlemen, all of you, Dr. Zhao, all of you, thank you for being doctors. And I mean that sincerely. People who have dedicated your lives to help save other people's lives. It's something to be celebrated. It's not, you shouldn't be persecuted because you're trying to save lives. Because for whatever reason, there's been some politicization of a particular drug that's been around for 65 years. I mean, there's something wrong here. But I want to thank all of you for being doctors. I want to thank you for your testimony. I hope people pay attention to this hearing. Again, I'm not pushing one drug over the other. What I'm pushing for is robust studies and investigation into early treatment of COVID so we can prevent deaths, we can prevent hospitalization. I'm for letting doctors be doctors and practice medicine and have the courage when there's no other option. And let's face it, right now, for early treatment, there's no other option. I think it is inhumane to basically tell somebody who is fearful, and justifiably so, I test positive for COVID. Is my oxygen level going to drop below 94? Can I do nothing to try and prevent that? I can't try a drug that's been prescribed for 65 years. I don't have the right to do that in some states. I just think that's unconscionable. It makes no sense. The risk-reward ratio is so in favor of giving these things a shot. When I had tested positive because I had one episode of AFib, my cardiologist talked me out of using hydroxychloroquine. And so I used quercetin instead, with zinc, with vitamin D, with vitamin C. I never developed a symptom. Now, maybe I'm just one of those lucky 40% that never did. I will tell you one thing, though. Had I developed symptoms, I would have found a doctor. I might have called up one of you, and I would have tried hydroxychloroquine. From what I know, I think the risk is so unbelievably low, even though I have AFib. I would have tried it because I don't want to go in the hospital. I think most Americans, if they know about things, if they think rationally about things, are going to want some type of treatment. So, again, with that, I just want to thank all of you for being doctors, for putting yourself in the line, because you will be criticized. I will be criticized. We're going to be raked over the social media. We'll probably be censored. I know, Dr. McCullough, you already have been censored. I mean, your video describing what you did as part of a trial was pulled off of YouTube, and we helped you get back on YouTube. There is something going on here. I hope the American public listens. I hope they pay attention. And I hope we end up developing early treatment for COVID so we can get this behind us. We're all sick of it. We want cures, we want therapies, we want the vaccine, but we can't wait for the vaccine. We've got to take action now. So again, thank you all. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until December 4th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.